You now have the floor. I apologise.
Thank you. Just first and foremost, $2 trillion US. That's what was exposed in the context of the recent FinCEN files. So the fact of the matter is, it's sophisticated, it's complex, and it's massive, and it's on a global scale. And the idea that national supervisors alone, or regulators or enforcers, can deal with this particular challenge simply is delusional. So from that context, we have to insist that we have closer cooperation, that we have proper international enforcement, and that we do say what we mean in terms of insisting that there's prosecutions. HSBC, JP Morgan, Barclays, Deutsche Bank, Standard Chartered, they're not tin-pot banks. They are massive banks that underpin the financial system across the globe. And yet they're named in these files. We have oligarchs, we have drug dealers, we have terrorists, we have all forms of everything going through these banking systems. And yet nothing happens. And we've consistently in this chamber highlighted this particular fact. But until such time as there is proper enforcement and more importantly, underpinning enforcement with resources, because these, as I said, are very sophisticated and complex. And from that point of view, I think that the European Union, the United States and other countries have to come together on an international level to ensure that we can root out this. We can go to any capital in Europe and see quite clearly that there is dirty money washing around very close to the regulatory systems.
Vielen Dank, Herr Kollege Kelleher. Und wir fahren.
Thank you, Mr. Kelleher. Now, Mr. Krah, you have the floor, sir.
Liebe Kollegen, meine
Colleagues, President, I'm hearing a great deal about new authorities, new regulations, new bans. But we need to ensure that what we do against money laundering is proportionate. The German authorities have invested €1 billion in compliance authorities. When SMEs open a new account at the bank, they have to fill in a massive pile of papers. It's all about forms. We want new financial police, new reporting obligations. Do you think that is going to deal with the weakness of the European Union? I can only warn against new regulation and new bans. What we have to be aware of is that there are criminals, and in the fight against those criminals, we shouldn't be causing more harm than the money laundering causes itself. Thank you very much. Mrs. Peter Hansen, you have the floor.
I will continue this speech in Danish, so that even Danske Bank can also hear me. Det er jo lidt sjovt at sidde.
It is rather strange to see 4 Danish members of the European Parliament in here today, but maybe it's not that strange. From 2007 to 2015, 1,500 million Danish kroner were going through Danske Bank in Estonia without the banks seeing any of it or without the authorities being aware of it. But last week we heard more information about this when the FinCEN files showed us that this was part of organized crime, a whole network using banks like Danske Bank to launder money. This is illegal weapon trade, drug dealers and terrorism. Money which we would much rather have used on the new climate law or anything else except strengthening the banks. So we're waiting to hear what the Commission action plan will be. I think it's superfluous to say it. Of course it needs to deliver it, and it has to be as strong as possible, because the FinCEN files have shown us that 1 in 5 of these transactions went through the Cayman Islands. And as my colleague from the GUI said, still Cayman Islands was removed from the list of tax havens. It's just as absurd as it sounds, and EU finance ministers will have to revise this list. In my group, we will work to have a strong list of tax havens. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, Mr. Morel, please.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Alors,
thank you very much. The financial scandals follow one another with all of their opaque practices, immoral acts, with astronomical amounts. And here we've got another example of this. And what I'm surprised about is that when the European leaders are talked about, people seem to just shrug or be resigned. And this is why we see anger, because the FinCEN files show criminal actions. And there have been directives, but they haven't been followed by firms. Deutsche Bank, 60% of these fraudulent actions. HSBC, which has made all sorts of promises about money laundering, is fully embedded in this. I mean, that's why we're so indignant. We need to do things. Now, of course, we can change the directives into regulations because we see that there are shortcomings, but there need to be sanctions. I'll just complete my comments. I think we need to make sure that we have European regulations and all of the necessary resources over and above national units.
Thank you, Mrs. Regner. Thank you, Madam President. Yet another financial scandal. We need to finally get an overview of what's going on so that we can begin to do away with these prings. And what we need is two things: centralized, strong controls and strong regulation. Money laundering transactions take place because banks can decide which transactions they believe are suspicious and which aren't. Banks that don't find a transaction suspicious don't stop the transaction. Often reports are handed in so late to the appropriate authorities that the authorities can no longer do anything. Often 166 days after the transaction's taken place, so the money's long gone. So what we need is well-trained people in banks. We need European-level supervision and appropriate supervision. Thank you. Now, Mr. Garicano.
Again, one more scandal. Again, I have to hear my colleagues on both sides of the aisle complaining, and again, we see that nothing happens in the fight against money laundering. I think that the key to the answer is that Europe needs to be more confident in this fight. We have shown that we can be regulatory leaders. We've put the GDPR standard, and some people would have been afraid that with this standard, Facebook or some others wouldn't operate in Europe. The fact of the matter is, for whatever their threats, they can't afford not to operate in Europe. This is similar. If we say to world companies, to companies based abroad, you can't operate here unless we know who is your owner, if we roll out beneficial ownership, it's not going to be the case that people are going to renounce to a 400 million market. They are going to want to be here. They are going to want to serve European citizens. So if we are confident, if we set up the regulatory standards for transparency, for disclosure, for this beneficial ownership, it's going to be the case that companies will have to complain. What are the main things we need to change the way this fight is going? I think we need three things. We need transparency, as I was saying, particularly no opaque companies. We need to know who is behind every account. We need a European financial intelligence unit. We need to know what's going on, and that requires police work. And we need a single supervisory authority that is able to centralize and that doesn't succumb to the economic nationalism that we are always seeing. Each authority kind of protecting their own banks and their own transactions, and each authority happy to receive money from abroad. So this is the moment to show that Europe is confident. I think I've been hearing all of my colleagues speak, and I've taken close notes, and I think that we all see things in a very similar way. We need to really change the way we're doing things. We need a confident Europe that leads in this path. Thank you.
Vielen Dank, Herr Kollege Garicano. Und wir fahren.
Thank you, Mr. Garicano. Now, Mr. Utterson, please.
Yes, thank you so much. Well, we're again in face of a major scandal. 2 trillion euros that have been going in money laundering, and the big institutions like Deutsche Bank are really affected. But what strikes me is that, okay, we have the information. It's a new investigation. We have to thank the journalists, but now we need to act. And here is where we really need a problem at the European level. We have to do much more. And there are three things, Madam Commissioner, that I think are extremely urgent. Firstly, as many of my colleagues have said before, we need this unit, this intelligence unit to fight money laundering and to fight financial crime. It's not in the action plan, but we need it. And I think that this Parliament is united behind that idea. Secondly, as Mr. Sven Giegold has mentioned before, when we have a serious problem at member state level of enforcing our framework against money laundering, we need infringement procedures, and it would be good for you to tell us when you will start doing that. And finally, and I will end here, I think it's really a shame that the Council has taken the Cayman Islands out of the tax haven list this week. This is something that our citizens cannot understand. Thank you so much.
Vielen Dank, und wir fahren fort mit.
Thank you. Mr. Roberti now, please.
Grazie, Presidente.
Thank you, President. The FinCEN files show once again the failure of anti-money laundering rules, given the fact that banks continue to draw profit from the crimes. AML directives aren't being implemented appropriately, not at all in some EU member states, and this is all the more serious given that we have an economic crisis caused by the pandemic, and that's giving more space to criminal organisations. We need a single system. We need a European anti-money laundering agency, which the Commission has been calling for a long time now. But above all, we need a single European strategy to deal with organised crime and their external accomplices. We need full investigative and judicial powers. I've been asking for that uselessly for a long time. I've been asking for a special committee to be set up in the Parliament against organised crime and terrorism, because these are a constant threat to the rule of law in the European Union. I hope that we will now find the political will to work together on this issue. We need to defend the legal economy from criminals. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Roberti. And our final speaker now is Mrs. Hahn. You have the floor.
Sehr geehrte Kollegen.
Colleagues, from the FinCEN files, we see how many holes there are in our anti-money laundering system. We see that criminal activity is supported by banks. They're working together with drug lords, and right in the centre of this is Deutsche Bank and Commerzbank. Criminals are circumventing the national supervision, showing that it's not working. Following the financial crisis, the banks don't seem to have any problem with this activity. And there are all of these loopholes, and this is why we need the member states to approve a central European authority and a statement that this should happen now and not years from now. And we also need a legal framework which is implemented in all member states, and we don't wait for violations. It's only if we have a coordinated approach that we'll be able to change things, and we need to act now.
Thank you, Mr. Hahn. Now I give the floor back to Vice President Suica for the Commission's response, please.